Okay, good morning, everyone. So, as Ian has said, my name is Jennifer, and I've been at NTU now for almost a year. I'm part of the policing team, and I joined, well, prior to joining NTU, I completed my PhD at the University of Bradford. I did my master's there actually, and then um, completed my PhD there before moving on. But I was actually a student at NTU, where I did my undergrad. So it's nice to come back. But also after I left Bradford, after I completed my PhD, I did work as an associate research fellow during my time at Bradford. And I also worked on the PQF program, which I'm sure a lot of you would have heard of, but I did that for about a year and a half and then moved to NTU. But at Bradford, my PhD took me quite a number of years to complete, but I eventually completed it. And my research basically focused on police reform and governance processes. And I focused specifically on transition societies in Africa. But obviously you can't study policing in Africa without understanding, to an extent, policing in contexts like the UK and France as well. So I looked at two African countries. I did a comparison between two African countries, so from a Francophone perspective and an Anglophone perspective. And for those of you who are not very familiar with the context of Africa, Africa is pretty much divided, dates back to colonialism, divided into, let's say, three main sections. So you've got Anglophone, which is English-speaking Africa, and Francophone, which is French-speaking Africa, and then you've got Lusophone as well. But when it comes to policing, the Francophone and Anglophone Africa pretty much dominate the discussions, in particular Anglophone though. But anyway, so for my research, I looked at UK's influence in Africa, in Anglophone Africa, using Sierra Leone as a case study. And then I looked at France's influence when it comes to police reform and governance processes, using Côte d'Ivoire as a case study. And Côte d'Ivoire's reforms actually finished not too long ago. So that's to an extent an ongoing case study, let's say. But Sierra Leone's reforms ended. By the time I was doing my research, they had already ended, and it was almost, the country was almost at a, let's say, top-up reform phase. But when it comes to police reform, I mean, it's a term that I'm sure a lot of people are going to become quite familiar with. In the development context, it's obviously a popular term, because usually when, let's say, a conflict end, you have external actors like the UK who will travel to assist countries like Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone, for example, went through a period of 10 years of conflict. And at the end of that conflict, reforms needed to occur in various sectors in society. And one of them was the security sector. And obviously the police comes under the security sector. So a lot of the times when reforms take place, the host country, let's say Sierra Leone, will have to initiate it. And then external actors like the UK will then obviously go in to support. They'll send officers who are seconded to assist in the reform efforts. And reforms can be lengthy in terms of time frame, or they can be short. It just depends on what the reforms are focusing on. And in general, the concept of police reform itself stems from a wider concept known as security sector reform, which again is influenced by another wider concept known as the security development nexus. So with the security development nexus, there's a belief that you cannot have security without development, and you can't have development without security. And this is where obviously the police then come in, where they play their own role when it comes to the security side of things, ensuring that there's security within a state, hence why reforms are important once a major conflict or a level of instability has occurred in a state. And a lot of the time, reforms, obviously, in the past, reforms used to focus a lot on the military, but now obviously there's a understanding that it's very important to focus on police reforms as well, because the police do have a key role to play in ensuring sustainable peace and security in any state globally. But obviously, there are often challenges when it comes to ensuring sustainability of reform efforts, in particular in developing context. But when it comes to the question of sustainability, obviously it's applicable beyond developing context as well. But a lot of the concept around security sector reform and police reform in particular seems to be to sort of be explored in the context of developing regions. So it's now interesting to see how it will work in the context of the UK, because there are obviously talks of reforms because of what's been happening around policing. But when it comes to just a bit more about security sector reforms, so it's actually a concept that was promoted by Claire Short in 1997. And it was initially designed as a developmental tool within DFID. And as a result, obviously, the department played a significant role in shaping just the thinking around the concept. And when it came to the application of the concept, they started with efforts in Sierra Leone and Uganda. And the approach in general aims to reconstruct the security sector in order to enhance it so that it's effective, it's efficient in its delivery, and it's also legitimate in its delivery. And when it comes to security sector reform, there's often three debates within security sector reform. So you've got some people argue that the focus should be on solely reforms. Others argue that it should be on governance, the governance of the security sector. Others argue that it should be about transforming the security sector. So where you sit on the in the debate depends on what your views are, really. I strongly believe in reform and governance, and I feel when it comes to sustainability, governance, effective governance of the newly reformed security sector is obviously important to ensure sustainability and to ensure that the police, for example, can contribute to the wider security nexus debate. And when it comes to police reform itself, police reform is basically all about transforming or changing a police organization into a professional and accountable police service that pretty much delivers and caters to the needs of society and to all communities, I guess, in society. And reforms can be, in general, be initiated for various reasons. So in the development context, it's often initiated because the use of excessive use of force. It could be because a conflict has ended and police institutions or that the police institution has pretty much been destroyed completely. So it could be that the reform is aiming to rebuild the whole institution, which means at times the organograms might be changed, legislation might be changed. It could just mean rebuilding it from the ground up, basically, or it could mean that certain aspects of the police institution are looked at as troubled areas. And so a troubled area could be capacity building, for example. A troubled area could be civil police relations. So whatever the issue is within the police institution, that's what the focus of the reform would be. But then the challenge often becomes how to sustain basically reforms once they are once a police institution has been reformed in one form or another. And in general, police reforms obviously aim to ensure that the police are more operationally effective, accountable, and that they respect human rights. And like I mentioned earlier, external actors like the UK at times do send officers to be seconded, and when officers are seconded to countries like Sierra Leone or Uganda, or any other developing country, it's often to provide mentoring to their counterparts in those countries, to engage in monitoring efforts, obviously, and to provide advice to foreign police at a strategic level. So in the context of Sierra Leone, for example, during my research, I did meet a seconded officer who was acting as advisor to the head of police at the time. So that's the equivalent of the chief constable, basically. And they were there for roughly 2 years. And when it comes, like I said, to the time frame of reforms, depending on the scale of it, it can be over a number of years, or it could be as short as 2 years, for example. So the officer I met there, they were only seconded for 2 years. And then obviously they were replaced by another officer and so forth. And Sierra Leone is actually having elections in June of this year. So officers, UK officers, have already been seconded there to assist with things like capacity building, because usually during electioneering processes, there tends to be trouble. And one issue that police forces in developing contexts like Sierra Leone face is capacity, resourcing, poor civil police relations, which obviously poor civil police relations seems to be a universal issue when it comes to policing, but in certain contexts it's more noticeable on a daily basis, really. But capacity building and poor delivery and resourcing some of the issues that the police in Sierra Leone, for example, face. And bear in mind that elections are fast approaching. Capacity building is one of the reasons why the UK, for example, would send officers to assist. But again, like I was saying, when it comes to sustainability of the efforts of external actors, a lot of the time, the efforts are not usually, there's usually a high reversion rate. So where reforms have occurred in one form or another, assistance has taken place, and the efforts of external actors is just not sustainable. And it's difficult to pinpoint why, but reasons from my research anyway were linked to lack of political will, lack of understanding of the context in which reforms were actually occurring, societal attitudes, which I believe will probably play a role in the context of the UK as well when reforms do fully kick in, because societal attitudes is part of what you can also term as the political economy of the reform processes. So, but I'll leave it at that. But a thing to remember, one of the three key things to remember anyway when it comes to implementation and sustainability challenges is obviously down to societal attitudes, lack of understanding at times of the context, be it, and the context might not necessarily it doesn't necessarily have to be at the country level. It could be just the community, not understanding the community in which officers, for example, are working in, or those who are looking to reform or lead the reform are working in, because understanding context does play a huge role. And like I said, of course, political will as well, because reforms can take a long time. So just obviously implementing the idea doesn't necessarily mean that there will be the uptake will be sustainable. That a lot of work does need to continue going on in order for reforms to actually work long term.
Are you still going, Jennifer, or are you finished?
No, I'm done. Sorry, I was just checking to make sure that because all I'm seeing are blank screens.
No, we're still here. It's okay. Just to make sure that everyone can see you on the screen as of when you're talking. So thank you very much. I can see some, certainly I think there's some interesting themes around Indigenous experience emerging across both. Certainly to me anyway, because you're talking, Caitlin, so far, it'll be interesting to ask some questions and explore this with everybody after the talks themselves. But thank you very much for that, and for sort of drawing out some of those, beginning to draw out some of those links between certainly the UK context and transitional context, especially given the legacy of colonialism, which again is something that perhaps we'll come back to a bit later on. I'm going to pass straight over to Shante Francis from our Youth Justice team here at Nottingham Trent to take us through the experiences of young people, youth violence, and the role of voice there. Do you want to try sharing, Shante, or do you want me to?
I'll try sharing, and if not, I will call on you.
I can't promise I'll be any better. I'll give it a go. So same thing, you've got about 15 minutes from when you start talking, and then we will take it all from there.
Okay.
You've got it.
You can see it. Oh, I can see it now too. Excellent. Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Shante Francis. I'm a senior lecturer on youth justice, but I'm a criminologist really. My PhD was in criminology, where I kind of looked at how young people understand the term violence within a rural context within the UK and within kind of a more inner city context within the UK. So I'm kind of just going to draw on some of those themes today, but also kind of present some of my future research, which will hopefully be taking place over the summer months, should kind of the organisations want to go ahead with it. So in essence, kind of the main way in which I like to kind of frame my research is almost kind of making youth voices kind of paramount within the issues that we discuss. And particularly when we're looking at violence or trying to understand what violence is, it's more imperative to understand it from a young person's perspective rather than trying to kind of adultify what is really essentially a young person's kind of concern. So in order to kind of understand that well, initial research kind of looked at how are young people framing the term violence, and some of the initial kind of responses were quite interesting. Initially, they couldn't really define what violence was. They used kind of more physical elements in terms of hitting or kicking. Interestingly, they didn't associate bullying with violence, and obviously violence can be broken down into the usual things that we see in terms of kind of gang violence, looking at knife crime, exploitation, but things also such as kind of bullying, sexual violence, online abuse and violence, that all kind of comes under that umbrella term of what violence is. But the young people that were within my first piece of research, they never really kind of associated the two, which was quite interesting. So it was kind of getting them to unpick how they understood it and why. And kind of one of the main reasons, or the main kind of justifications or the ways in which those young people understood that term was race. And they kind of wanted to unpick why they understood it that way. Race was one of the main themes, along with kind of media and also gender. But for the purposes of today, race is kind of going to be the main focus. So it discussed how for the young people, they were very aware of how in media can in some terms twist or shape perceptions of particular people within society, and they were very aware and upfront about that, which was nice and surprising given their ages. They were quite young, kind of secondary school. It was very prominent discussion within their talks, particularly within their focus groups, and they were very kind of open and honest with each other about how they were trying to frame race. And this was kind of a common finding across both cohorts, regardless whether they were from the inner city context or looking at it from a rural context. Race was kind of this one area in which they kind of wanted to discuss. In terms of looking at it within kind of the rural context, this was kind of up in the northwest of the UK. There was almost kind of this othering process, which they were trying to kind of break down for themselves. So one quote here saying, yeah, the young people, take note, and they just go like, oh, most people have that thing with them, like white people are good and the other associated with bad people. And within this discussion, what this young person was trying to kind of convey is that they are very aware that that's not necessarily the case, but they know that that's kind of what's being pushed forward. They had a lot more insight than I think I initially anticipated as a researcher. And it was interesting at the time because when I was doing this research, it was kind of within the height of Brexit. So I think tensions were high anyway, kind of when it came to race or immigration or anything like that. And within this particular neighborhood up in the Northwest, it was very rural, very, I suppose, disadvantaged. The transport links were awful. So there was kind of transportation poverty there and lots of other things going on. And they still use terms kind of quite freely within this area in terms of like coloured. They use the word coloured people quite often. But it didn't seem as if they were trying to use it maliciously or to kind of evoke a reaction from me. But I think that was just kind of their common social language to discuss people that maybe look different from them. And it was quite interesting to see them break that down. And they associated obviously a lot of that with media coverage and what they saw on their different social media platforms. In terms of looking at this from a inner city perspective, and when we were doing the focus groups, one of my most favorite findings was when I had a mixed gender of similar age young people within a focus group, and they were discussing what violence means to them, and they got onto the topic of race. One young girl points to a young boy within the focus group who was mixed race, and she says, Malcolm, look, he looks like a fighter. And then he responds to say, so what, dark coloured people? And she was kind of saying, no, I didn't kind of mean that. But then he stops her in her tracks and he kind of tries to not justify what she's saying, but he's trying to take a step back without getting too angry and almost kind of rationalize how she's understanding her opinions. So he says, this is what I'm saying. When you think of violence, you don't think of two white people fighting, do you? Honestly, let's be honest, you think of dark people, simple as, period. It's not racist, you do, because it's more advertised on dark people like WorldStar. WorldStar's basically, it's kind of almost like a website which is kind of advertised on social media platforms, and there's loads of kind of fighting videos and things on there. It's very popular, much more from a kind of American perspective. There's usually loads of black people on there kind of fighting and doing silly things. And that's kind of what they're referring to. And he said it's all black people fighting. So in this instance, the reason why this was one of kind of my more favorite findings was because you very rarely kind of get to have that honest conversation between adults, and having a young person step back and hear a comment like that. Somebody's purposely picked him out of this particular group and said, actually, when I think of violence, I think of somebody that looks like that. And for that young person to then step back and say, I'm annoyed, but I understand why, was actually really refreshing. And they managed to, within the group, there was just lots of head nodding, like as he was talking. And even the young girl that kind of initially stated that, she was kind of nodding her head with him, being like, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to convey. It just didn't come out the way I initially planned. So race played a huge part in this. And in kind of within all of these discussions, we have this kind of bigger picture around kind of adultification, and particularly when we're looking at children of colour, or we're looking at Asian youth or black children, adultification becomes this much more kind of embedded concept. We don't tend to see children, and particularly when we're looking at the youth justice system, as children first. We tend to look at it as offender first, whereas really the youth justice system within the UK wants to promote that child first, offender second agenda, which is brilliant, but in practice it doesn't necessarily always work. So we see here that a lot of black children may lack autonomy, or they're seen as kind of more resilient, and particularly when we're looking at safeguarding cases, and in essence when we're looking at violence, which is a safeguarding case, if we're seeing black children or Asian children as more resilient or more able to cope, then this can become a much deeper rooted issue, and we miss kind of potential signs for help or ways to kind of intercept or early intervention. So adultification can play a massive part. And obviously within all of this, we do have areas of media or different social media platforms which will portray particular images or portray, for instance, Black children as deviant or ill-willed, or however they may want to frame that. So this can therefore then play into our social structures, such as our main institutions, healthcare, our criminal justice system, our schooling. And kind of just to highlight this issue, there is a case I'm sure you're all aware of, Child Q, but to kind of give you a brief overview, this is where adultification is kind of at the forefront, really. This young girl was suspected of carrying weed on her. She was only 15. She was on her period at the time. She was called out of classroom and strip searched without an adult present. It was found that she had no cannabis on her at all. But this is kind of adultification kind of at its core. They missed calling an appropriate adult while this process was going on. There wasn't kind of significant reason for them to kind of strip search her the way they did. And it's almost, if we kind of really wanted to be quite frank about it, this is almost kind of a form of abuse, really. Not only an abuse of power, but just physical, sexual abuse, however you want to frame it, really. And furthermore, they've taken her voice away. They weren't listening to her request. They weren't listening to the fact that she asked for an appropriate adult and that wasn't respected. So in terms of looking at youth voice, it is paramount and essential to not only involve children within our research, but also promote their voice wherever we can, because in many instances, children and young people's voices are not heard, or they are heard but not listened to, and the two ideas are very different. So within the research that I'm hoping to do over the summer, as long as the organisations kind of agree, is highlighting voice as paramount in understanding youth issues. And the organisation I'm hoping to work with kind of looks at wanting to tackle crime within local areas. So it's kind of located within disadvantaged communities within Nottingham. They do a lot of sport activities, mentoring, and it's almost kind of an evaluation of the project, but highlighting that youth voice. It furthermore will seek to understand how kind of race affects the interaction between kind of staff, or how their own kind of self-esteem builds as a result of that. What are the impacts of that organisation on these young people? And in order to kind of really highlight this, speaking to them and pushing that voice forward is essential. So yeah, I don't kind of want to keep going on. I realise I've only got 5 minutes left. But kind of one last thing is to kind of say, when we're discussing children and adulthood, is it an area that we could potentially think of as a continuum rather than a cut-off point? In the UK, we very much go by ages for things. So you can be held for criminal responsibility at the age of 10, but you can't, you know, for instance, consent to sex till you're 16. You become an adult at 18, but are we thinking about it the wrong way? And maybe the promotion of youth voice can help kind of unpick and demystify the way in which we as adults think about things. So yeah, that's it. I'm done. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Shante. And again, voice and sort of, I guess, perhaps the lack of voice for young people here really shining through. And I think that's a theme that I'm going to come back to. I'm going to steal Chair's privilege for the first round of questions. Apologies, everyone, because I think there's a couple of bits that have stuck out to me across all the presentations so far. But hopefully everyone else will start posting some questions up after I've asked that one. So we'll pass across straight away to Chris McGill from Brighton for the next one. And Chris, would you like me to share, or do you want to share for yourself?
I think I might be able to share. Let's have a go.
It's the first time in my life technology will have done what it wants for everybody if this works.
Is that working?
I can see the general slides. I can't see the PowerPoint screen, if you like. So I can see the slide. There it is. That's the one.
There it goes. Okay. Lovely.
There, we've got it. Fabulous.
Yeah.
I will hand over to you then. So this is Dr. Chris McGill speaking to families and prisoners taking stock. Same thing, about 15 minutes, Chris, and I will see you shortly.
Oh, lovely, and thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. at the webinar this morning. I really appreciate it. Just to give you a little bit of background on who I am, what I do. I'm currently a senior lecturer in law with criminology at the University of Brighton. Prior to that, I was a senior lecturer in criminology at London South Bank University. And a bit like Caitlin, only back to front, I was for 10 years working for government, Ministry of Justice, Home Office and the CPS in a researcher role. That was prior to my returning to academia and taking up my posts at London South Bank University. Today I'm talking about families and prisoners, and it's based really on my PhD research. But my interests and my teaching, my research nowadays mostly revolve around violence against women and girls, particularly domestic abuse, honour-based violence, sexual offending, and really community and criminal responses to that violence. But today I'm talking about families and I'm talking about prisoners, and it's very much based on my research I did for my PhD. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be sharing some findings from what is a reflective and critical review of recent policy developments around prisoners' family ties. Now, the key message here is that the policy landscape in this area has shifted and changed in the last decade or so. And alongside this, we've seen academics increasingly turning their attention to the issues here. But my view is there's still much more work to be done. I focused my commentary around three main themes here: policy, reflections, and also then contradictions and complexities. And this presentation is the basis of a paper that's going to be published later on this summer in an international journal. So any feedback and comments are always welcome. So let's turn our attention to policy in the first instance. So when we think about developments in official prison policy terms, specifically in relation to families in prisons, there's one individual who perhaps is most likely to spring to one's mind, and that is Lord Farmer. Now, he's published a review into women in prison and their families, but the focus of my talk today and the paper I'm publishing is his earlier review, the one that was published in August 2017, that looked to the importance of strengthening prisoners' families' ties to prevent reoffending and reduce intergenerational crime. Now, this inquiry, this work was commissioned by the Conservative government back in September 2016. So we're talking pre-Brexit here, which feels like an awful long time ago. And it was part of a wider set of reforms around prisons that were under consideration at the time. This publication, Lord Farmer's report, very much focused on male prisoners, and that's what I'm talking about today, male prisoners. So the focus on family ties is very much in evidence in Farmer's review here. I mean, it's clearly articulated in the title. It talks about prisoners' families' ties, the importance of strengthening them, but it's not so new, this focus on family ties. Lord Woolf, for example, way back in the 1990s in his report into the prison disturbances, commented on the vital importance of prisoners' links with families. And there's been subsequent reports since that have focused on prisoners' family ties. For example, New Labour's Reducing Reoffending National Action Plan that was published in 2004 talked about the potential in working with children and families to support rehabilitation. But I think it's fair to say, really, that not before Farmer have the families of prisoners found themselves so very much featured very centrally and prominently in official penal policy considerations. Now, what's more, this focus that we'd not seen previously to Farmer very much couches itself in particular expectations, and those expectations really hinge on the potential for families to fulfill a function around rehabilitation, and in turn contribute to reducing reoffending. So, for example, in the last few years or so, we've seen the language emanating from official channels whereby families are described as the most effective resettlement agency. And the Inspectorate of Prisons report, which was published in 2016, highlighted family contact as the key source of support for prisoners. Now, Farmer himself references the resource that is good family relationships as the golden thread that needs to run through policy, and all a prison does. So you see there in that quote from Farmer's report, very much defining families as a resource and highlighting the importance of family relationships and the extent to which they should be the golden thread that runs through policy and all that prison does. So that focus on families of male prisoners here is very clear. So now I'd like to turn my attention to some broad reflections on the implications of the policy. 3 reflections here. First of all, we've got moving the responsibility onto the families for reoffending. So families here, by and large, we're talking about women who research has shown time and time again are already marginalised, suffering inequality, operating on the edges of society in disadvantage, and who, by virtue of their status, potentially finding themselves pushed even further into the margins of society, pushed even further into poverty, more disadvantage, and faced with deeper inequalities. And also additional challenges there that come with being a family linked to somebody who's just as involved is the stigma. So Helen Codd in 2008 spoke about how, regardless of the gender of the inmates, it is women who bear the burdens of caring from the outside. And also we see a quote here from Corsten, who talks about men's lives outside prison are sustained in their absence. The women in their lives care for their children, and often their parents too, maintain their homes, visit them in prison, send them money for cigarettes and phone calls, and generally keep the home fires burning. So really what Corsten is alluding to here, and what other academics have commented on in the past, is the very gendered nature of caring for prisoners. It's been well documented in the research, and I think it's important that we continue to acknowledge the very gendered nature of supporting prisoners. So positioning families within this broad utilitarian policy framework, as referenced by Farmer, erode choice. My argument here is that women should be able to exercise choice, and that framing families of prisoners who are inevitably women in that way that Farmer does really erodes choice. Or maybe the question there is, does it not erode choice? There continues to be no agency with sole responsibility for families of prisoners. If we want to know more about the families of prisoners, if we're interested in answering the question, who are prisoners' families, we have little choice but to draw inferences from what we know about the prisoners. We define families in relation to the prisoners, and I think this is an issue of itself, and the terminology reflects this. We talk about prisoners' families. Helen Codd, an academic who's done quite a bit of work in this area, one of my contemporaries, she touches on this in her text, In the Shadow of Prison. The question here is revisiting this debate so families are recognised and maybe even foregrounded in the language that we use. And I think that's particularly important considering the policy context that reinforces families as a resettlement resource. And I think we need to think about the power and the politics of words. You know, language is important, and oppressive language really deepens the invisibility of the families of prisoners. And following on from that, I think we need to remind ourselves, and it's stated time and time again in the literature, that the families are not all one of the same. They're not an homogenous group. And I made this exact statement in my own PhD research. And as I say, research time and time again points to the diversity. Yes, we are talking by and large about women, and early research in this area very much focused on then the typical prisoners' family, that is, partners and children of male prisoners. But within this, the families of prisoners, there is much, much diversity in relation to their family ties. And I wonder how that sits against a policy that inevitably adopts a one-size-fits-all approach. So turning now to sort of contradictions and complexities. So here I want to think about reconceptualizing the family. And the question here is the extent to which Farmer's review, and indeed the research in this area, is in step with current academic debates around who and what are families. So Mason and Booth in 2018, they talk about how vital it is to unpick what is meant by the family. Jardine in 2018, his recent paper references Fincher's theory of family practices, and this article argues that family relationships are affected by imprisonment are not only highly individual, but also actively constructed through embodied displays of care and commitment. Research have started to acknowledge these issues around reconceptualizing the family, but I wonder to what extent has policy got to that point. And also just harking back to this idea about diversity, there are still voices in this area who have not been heard. The silent minorities is what I like to reference them. And this includes families of Black and Asian minority ethnic groups, families of so-called foreign nationals. And I note I'm not overly comfortable with these terms because they mask a diversity. Families of Muslim prisoners, although there's been a little bit of research recently in that area, it's still very limited. Still very limited. We have some early findings looking at parental imprisonment. So this is where we start to think about young people and the impact on youth of having parents in prison. Farmer is silent when it comes to the families of Muslim prisoners, and the policy framework that was developed further to Farmer is similarly silent, and it speaks on a very general level about the need to comply with the duty of care under the Equality Act. But essentially, it's left to individual governors to tackle the issues in this area. So one final theme I'd like to mention here is misplaced expectations. And here I'm thinking about families who are fighting for justice. I'm thinking about families where domestic abuse is an issue. I'm thinking about prisoners who were formerly in care. So how does the policy that focuses on families as a resource for resettlement work in relation to these particular groups? And one example I particularly like to draw attention to are those families who are united and politically active and engaged in public campaigns to reform or invoke change in relation to their loved ones' imprisonment. One or such organisation that immediately springs to mind to me is JENGBA, so Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association, a grassroots campaign comprised mostly of women who work against convictions made under joint enterprise. Now, what's interesting here is that some academics have talked about relatives of prisoners as rarely campaigning or presenting a public face. Yet here we have a group, quite a powerful group, a grassroots activist organisation who are doing just that. And I think it's important to acknowledge this. It reinforces this idea that families of prisoners are not a homogenous group. And secondly, when one places families fighting against a system that is simultaneously placing expectations upon them to act as a resettlement resource, I think we get an interesting dynamic, an interesting tension there then is exposed. So just to bring my presentation, my paper to a close, in the last decade or so, we've seen a welcome surge of interest in the families of prisoners amongst the academic circles. And such efforts, I would argue, has achieved much in terms of addressing the criticisms that were angled at early scholarship in this area, scholarship on this topic. And it has, to some extent, shifted the analytical lens from a single one-dimensional viewpoint to a discussion that is a little bit more beyond those traditional interpretations of the family, to acknowledge the diversity of, contemporary relationships, modern day families. The existence of intersection inequalities and oppression, I think, has also started to emerge in the literature. However, there's still much more work to be done, and this work is even more important, I think, when we consider the positioning of prison policy, the very firm tethering of families to a rehabilitative function. Research needs to continue to highlight the diversity of prisoners' families and place those who have yet to have their voice heard central to our inquiries. And we also need to remember that this is about women. This way we guard against the rhetoric that defines families, bracket women, as little more than a resource, a rhetoric that reinforces gendered stereotypes and places their needs second place to those of a relative or a loved one who is in prison. And that brings me to a close. Thank you very much for listening. As I say, this is a paper in draft to be published later on in the summer. So I welcome any comments or questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. I don't quite know how, because I've never seen it happen, but we've had everybody stick to time right the way through that. And I'd like to welcome back Caitlin, Jennifer and Shante back to the conversation as well. If anybody has questions, please do raise your hand or post them up in the chat page for us. I'm, as I said, going to steal Chair's prerogative on this one because I am and I can. And hey, what else do white males do when they're in the middle of a symposium anyway? So one of the big themes that's really emerged to me across all of this is the centering of voice, both for, well, variously for, Caitlin, you mentioned briefly, I forget the name of the communities, the Indigenous communities you mentioned, but you mentioned the Indigenous land, Indigenous communities there. And I think I'm interested to hear a bit more about how Indigenous communities are able to access or not access the VCAT system. Shante, obviously, voice is crucial here for young people. Jennifer, again, voice of Indigenous populations and African populations in these processes of transition and change really strikes me, and Chris, the voices of women and families. How do you all think we can open up space for these conversations and for these voices to be heard much more readily? And how can we transform different justice systems or reconceptualize them? Oh, that's a horribly broad question, but I'm going to run with it anyway. I'll leave it for you guys to work out who wants to go first.
I can start. Yes, I think it's a really important point to acknowledge, which is VCAT is set up as an alternative, low cost, supposed to be accessible tribunal, but that is still very much based in Western ideas of access to justice, and that is a like Indigenous voice is a sort of an ongoing priority for government in terms of access to VCAT. So for residential tenancy disputes, there have been advocacy groups that have identified that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander renters are more likely to fail to attend a VCAT hearing than a white renter, and that's but that is because of the way in which the VCAT system is set up and structured, and even the way the hearing proceeds, and it's not necessarily a culturally safe space. So things that VCAT is trying to do is trying to sort of set up specific Koori hearing rooms that do adopt more of those culturally appropriate practices and processes, but at the same time they're not everywhere. And I think, as you sort of would recall, there's such a huge volume of residential tenancies moving through, and I have no doubt that there would be a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that wouldn't necessarily have identified themselves, and so wouldn't necessarily have been given the opportunity either. And then I think, thinking about intersectionality, if you think about public housing tenants who also are trying to go to VCAT to have their dispute heard, they're already against the Department of Housing, the Director of Housing, so they already face a significant disadvantage. And then if you bring into the mix that they are also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, it's not necessarily a safe space, and there is a lot more that needs to be done.
Thanks, Caitlin. Would anyone like to follow up on that? You're still muted, Jennifer.
Sorry. So when it comes to reform processes in development context, from my research, I found that a lot of the time, when it comes to the planning of the reform, if it's a large scale reform anyway, which in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, is what I pretty much met there, because at the time, in similarity to Sierra Leone, the country had actually gone through a phase of 10 years of political instability. Unlike Sierra Leone, obviously, it wasn't in one phase, it was in at least 3 different phases, but every time, basically, there was instability, and then there was stability. The country pretty much continued in terms of its development, which was good to see in the context of Côte d'Ivoire. And the French were obviously there with a whole range of other actors, because reforms aren't just done by one external actor. The country would, let's say, put a call out, and then the different external actors will then turn up and offer assistance in various areas. Some might give money, some might offer resources, some might decide to train. And when it comes to building civil police relations, it does tend to be a key part of reforms in general. But a lot of the time, you have to remember, in developing context, the population aren't, let's say, as educated as the population in the UK. So even though individuals, members of the, I spoke to, basically, as part of my research, I had interviews and focus group discussions with individuals that I felt represented the makeup of the society. So I spoke to, let's say, taxi drivers, market women, students, individuals who were educated, in particular in Côte d'Ivoire. The population there is a bit more educated than the population in Sierra Leone. So, but one of the complaints that I did get from the majority of the people I spoke to, be it the very well educated to the market women and local youths, they did complain that they were not necessarily invited into the process. So they would have liked to have a say in how they wanted their security sector, newly reformed security sector, to look. And only certain members of society were actually invited to attend or to be part of the process. And I still can't quite get my head around how they were chosen, because I did actually host a Q&A in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, to try and understand the level of participation of just the general public. Some didn't even know that there were reforms going on. And at the time in Côte d'Ivoire, there were 102 reforms going on in all sectors of society, one being the security sector, and then specifically the police, obviously. And the individuals did not even know. So they, in fact, they thanked me for what was happening in their own country. So so that was interesting. And then when I did obviously approach the police about it, they then set up a Q&A session where they invited representatives from different communities who they've been working with closely. And they pretty much set up a scene where they well, it was only meant to be a focus group discussion, but it ended up being a Q&A because they invited way too many people and made it seem as if they had a very good relationship with the population, but which obviously contradicted what I had heard from others that I'd spoken to. So that was quite interesting. But a lot of the time, in terms of willingness to involve the members of the general public, it's usually there. But for some reason, in terms of actually implementing or making it seem, turning it into a reality tends to be quite difficult. And I'm not quite sure why. And yeah, but there's a gap there anyway in understanding. So I don't know if there's a lack of willingness from the population to want to get involved fully in the whole process, or if the government just do not necessarily like their population being involved, because you also have to remember in contexts like Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, the police and other security sector actors pretty much exist to protect the regime in government. They're not there to really serve the general public like they would in the UK. I mean, obviously some might argue that that's not the case. Obviously in the UK, they probably do serve the ruling elite as well, but that's an argument for another day. But in developing contexts, it's more prominent basically, and people there tend to a lot of the time find their own ways of providing security, daily security for themselves. And so things like vigilantism is quite common in those contexts, because people just don't necessarily rely on state security providers like the police, because then to them they're not really there for them. So there's always that friction basically. So maybe that could be a contribution, that could be a contributing factor as to why the general public aren't really drawn into reform processes as much as they should really. Or even if they are, then they just don't show that much interest in it.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'll pass across to Shantae or Chris.
Yeah, so in terms of considering voice, yes, it's paramount, particularly within the work that I do. But if we were to involve children and young people more within research, I think sometimes we frame children as young people not knowing what they're talking about, or not understanding their world that they live in. And I think there's almost like an unwritten antagonism between adults, children and young people, because we have it so boxed off as to what a child should be, what a young person should be, what an adult should be. And when we don't see children or young people fitting these particular norms, and obviously this can change for different social contexts or societies, then we push them to the side. They're a problem, they're an issue. And we're constantly seeing children and young people as an issue, when really that is already a really difficult time for for a teenager, for instance. It's already a turbulent time. So just by asking them a simple question, which was kind of highlighted in some of my work, where I said, what are your opinions on violence, or what do you think of it? And they said, nobody has ever asked us that before. We never get asked our opinion on anything. And these are kind of like, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And it was great research from a research perspective, because they want to talk about it. They're engaged, they want to kind of discuss issues which are really prominent within their communities. However they're framing that. But it was also quite sad, because why are we not asking children and young people about issues that are affecting them? And how is it affecting them? How is it impacting them? How are they defining these issues that we see? We're seeing knife crime splashed across the newspapers, but that's an issue that's very London centric. If we shift our perspective to, let's say, the Midlands or the Northwest, where it was very rural, how they're framing violence is going to be very different. So this, I can't remember who drawn on it, but I think it was you, Chris, who mentioned a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work. And that's the same when we're looking at violence. You can't just take one aspect and locate it to all young people, because the way they are framing these issues, or how we are framing the issues, are going to be very different. So yes, pushing their voice forward is the way forward. we are putting child first, offender second, and therefore we are treating children as experts within their own right. So yeah, that's kind of what I would like to portray within future research too, to kind of keep pushing that forward, give them a voice in places where they don't necessarily have it.
Thanks, Shante. Chris?
Yeah, this is a challenging one, because families of prisoners are so often so far on the margins of society and disadvantaged, and you know, particularly the stigma that can be attached to you know, having a loved one in prison means that their voices, quite often perhaps they would rather not their voices were heard. So it's really challenging, you know. Yet we have these families who have really taken on the mantle and the fight to put their case out there and sort of taken that more activist role. So you have some sections of the community who are very vocal and very active, and then others which are completely silent, not heard, and perhaps have a preference to be that way because of the stigma that society imposes upon them, and you know, everything else that they have to contend with on top of being a family of a prisoner. I imagine the emotional energy possibly just isn't there. So yeah, it's a really tricky one, that. I mean, there's been a lot of research, more research recently done around families and prisoners, but I don't see that has particularly had any impact in terms of reform or movement and on a sort of policy context. We still see this responsibilization of families. You know, we want your partner not to reoffend, therefore, you know, you have to visit him, you have to support him, you have to be there for him when he's released. But what do we give the families? Very little, you know. In fact, we probably make prison policy and prison in practice probably makes their lives even more challenging if you think about all the issues around visits, so on and so forth, particularly further to COVID. It's, you know, it's not a happy place for them, not a happy time.
Thanks, Chris. So there's a question from Sean in the chat. Do you all believe that there is, or to what extent do you believe there is a link or lack of a link to the lack of voice given cohorts based on the amount of political involvement? So thinking specifically, perhaps, I'm very much interpreting based on the comments there around the lack of voting power for prisoners, for example, the lack of voting power for young people in England and Wales as well, where the minimum age is still 18. And the ripple effect that this has for families and other groups as well. He's talking about the Scandinavian model, where we see positive outcomes in most measurements of quality of life and recidivism, and issues around the media sort of setting and framing these political agendas when it comes to crime punishment, and we can easily extend that to engagement with civil matters as well. Follow-on question, kind of to what we've already had, is what can we do to get some of those conversations started around maybe addressing apathy, addressing lack of voting power, that sense of disenfranchisement among some groups?
Well, there is definitely a lack of voice, particularly for young people. And if we're talking about politics, I mean, where do we begin? There's a lot of there's been lots of discussions about young people, but not involving them. If we were to take the pandemic as just an example, that was tough on everybody, but particularly young people who were more disadvantaged, where you have things not such as, and we're not talking about, you know, not being able to go to school, but not being able to access materials needed for school because you have things such as like technology poverty, or you don't have access to Wi-Fi, and that's on top of already struggling families that may not be able to feed their families, and these are kind of more long-term effects from COVID for young people. But these are also within very much like the political arena, the political discussions that are being had at the moment. But again, being had about young people, but not with young people. So yes, Scandinavian models are excellent all-rounders for young people, families. Recidivism rates are very low. The way they just treat their young people, they're at the forefront. They're at the forefront of all the decisions that are made within all of their models. I had the chance to kind of visit and just kind of look at the way they do things, and it was just excellent. Very, very different from here. We're very much always between the nexus of welfare and justice when it comes to young people, and unfortunately most of the time we tend to take a justice perspective. In some instances they are very much more welfare based. Everything is to push them forward, to gain the skills, to make them part of the part of society. So when it comes to politics, the age arguably is too high at 18, when you can make so many more decisions which can be very impactful on your life at a much younger age. But again, there needs to be a discussion around how would we get young people involved in politics. I know we have youth groups that go into Parliament to discuss particular issues which are relevant to them, but then where does it go from there? We introduce them to it, but we don't get them involved in the main discussions that therefore, you know, impact their life down the line when they are able to become adults and vote. The decisions that we've made as adults are already impacting them as children. So yeah, they need to be brought in much sooner. But how we do that effectively and in a way where they don't feel like they have to, or that they're more informed to make a good informed decision, I'm not 100% sure how we do that yet. But if I figure it out, I'll get back to you.
Thanks, Shante. Any thoughts from anyone else? Chris, is that you are muting deliberately, or has it just magically happened?
It just magically happens. I was thinking a little bit about the media, really, and how influential it is around setting the political agenda. And you know, I always in this area I come back to this idea that you know, politically there's no votes for prisoners. There's no votes to be won by highlighting the plight of prisoners and their families. So it's yeah, it's a really challenging one. I neither do I have the answer, and I will also come back to you if I do.
I've got a question that I kind of feel like I want to follow up a little bit. Coming back to your presentation a little bit, Jennifer, you mentioned at the start about the legacies of colonialism, particularly the legacies of British and French colonialism in terms of the experiences and the construction of law and law enforcement in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, particularly, but also across the rest of the African continent after everything that happened historically. To what extent to what extent do you think that the secondment practices we currently have, so for example, for British police officers going abroad to provide advice and guidance, training and mentorship to communities and policing teams and security teams in developing transitional societies, how problematic is that? Because we're talking about, we know there's issues in the UK policing. We've seen that come through very, very clearly in Casey. And then we're going abroad and say, here you go, here's some of our officers that are embedded in some of these practices and these institutions. Does that cause, or does that subsequently compound some of these challenges, do you think?
When it comes to external involvement in reforms, or just helping, obviously, developing regions level up to the rest of the world when it comes to security, because when you think of you know, the performance of police institutions globally, they have to perform. They have to meet local performance needs. They have to meet the needs of the communities in which they situated in. They have to meet state needs, and they have to meet international needs as well. Hence why some police forces, for example, cannot go on international missions, because they don't quite they don't meet the need, they don't meet the requirements in terms of capacity, resourcing, training, all those sort of things. And this is where the likes of the UK, France, and America, that, like I said, they're usually so many different actors anyway, but the key actors when it comes to Anglophone and Francophone does tend to be France and the UK, and obviously that goes back to the colonial history. But apart from the colonial history, it's also one way of, from my point of view, ensuring influence globally, because, as you know, at the international level, well, international politics is very interesting, but aside from, the UK already has very strong ties with countries like Sierra Leone, dating back to the colonial history. But obviously, if, for example, the UK leaves that space, another country is always willing to take over. China is always in Africa. At the moment, it's, you know, providing certain things that African countries have struggled or continue to struggle to get from countries like the UK. So there's always a void. And it's important for countries like the UK to maintain strong ties with countries like Africa or former colonies. Obviously, the strong ties isn't always, and obviously maintaining that relationship comes in different forms, and one form is definitely providing assistance when it comes to security and other things in society. But the police ensuring efficient policing service is definitely one of the goods that the UK offers. And aside from that, by ensuring security on Sierra Leone soil, is also ensuring security in the UK, because at the end of the day, being a former colony, if anything happens in Sierra Leone, let's say if there's a level of instability, citizens from Sierra Leone are more likely to travel over to the UK, for example, than to France, because obviously because of the colonial history. So there are loads of reasons why countries like the UK has to continue, you know, building ties and maintaining ties with countries like Sierra Leone. So even if there are issues at home, obviously it's going to be quite interesting to see how reforms, so some of these ideas that are promoted elsewhere, you know, implemented in the UK context. But I can't predict. I can only highlight some of the issues that the UK faces, or UK officers faces when they do go to contexts like Sierra Leone. So, for example, like I said, political will, you know, changing societal views on certain things is quite difficult. And that's why I mentioned that, for example, when it comes to racism, it's tackling that will probably have to be from a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach, which in developing regions does tend to happen a lot of the time. Reforms can be a top-down approach, but at times, depending on what the issue is, it can be a bottom-up approach, which is what's needed, because obviously the rest of societal involvement is needed for reforms to be sustainable. But it's going to be interesting to see how it's played out in the UK context compared to developing regions anyway. But like I said, officers are seconded for a whole range of reasons. It's not just what you see on the surface. It's yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer.
There's a couple of questions. It's long-winded.
Yeah, I think so. That's fine. Long-winded questions are often necessary for academic stuff. So that works well. I really like your mug. I've got one of them somewhere as well. Geraldine's asked, she'd like to know a bit more about the different methods that you've all found helpful in accessing the views of partners of children, of people in prison, young people experiencing and witnessing and subjected to violence, and others that have taken part in your various research. And I guess if we extend that to your role in a slightly different context as well, Caitlin, about sort of how those views are collected and interpreted as part of the court service reforms that you're going through as well. Who would like that one first?
I can speak to that one. just based on the research I did for my doctorate, which was very much involved spending a lot of time hanging around prisons. But it was a little bit more than that, because I was mindful that part of my research was to give this section of the community a voice, but I was keen to give something back in that context. So my research did involve spending a lot of time hanging around outside prisons, but not in a sort of loose kind of way. I volunteered in the visitor centres outside of the prisons that I was conducting research around, and I spent a great deal of time just, giving my time in those centres, performing whatever functions were required, mostly serving tea and coffee or signposting visitors' families to different sources of support. So that was a method that I found helpful in accessing the views of partners and families of prisoners. But also during occupying that role of volunteer, supporting the family, supporting the visitor centre, supporting the staff, doing that voluntary role, I was also embarking on observation. So I was able to observe as part of my research, as well as after a fair amount of time to, speak to the families themselves and interview them on a more formal basis around their experiences. So that was one method I found particularly helpful in terms of accessing the views of the community I was interested in giving a voice to, really.
Thanks, Chris. Go for it, Shante.
Just kind of drawing on that. So for mine, one of the most, I utilised interviews and focus groups, but prior to that, the most informative and kind of best way to get the young people speaking about a topic which they haven't been asked about before, and to build that rapport, was just to give them like 10, 15, 20 minutes just to kind of mind map their ideas, with violence being the term in the middle, and for them just to draw, write down, or bullet point anything that comes to mind surrounding that term. Not only did that then open up a lot of discussion between the group, but that then also made them feel more comfortable about things that they wanted to discuss, because they could see their peers noting down similar things, and then they were able to kind of group them together, and it was just kind of a fun exercise, really, to kind of ease them into what is a very sensitive topic. So yeah, that was kind of one of the main methods, and I think if I were to do anything with young people again, I think that would be one of my go-tos, because it, you can use it within your work, but it's also just a great tool to get them engaged in the topic that you're looking at.
Thanks, Shante. Caitlin, if we come to you in terms of how the court service engages with various voices.
Thanks. I might speak of just a bit more broadly, just as being a public servant. So if we embark on research, it's really because government has decided that there is a policy problem that needs to be resolved. And so with that creates a lot of expectations. So there is, I think, there is an implicit expectation that when you do consult with people, that you're making a commitment to try and drive change, which I feel is sort of, having been in academia, it does sort of, I think, kind of constrain and limit the methods and the promises and the engagement that you have. So sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat. She's going a bit crazy in the background. But yeah, so one of the key challenges with working in public service is that often things are quite confidential until they're not, which means that you can't necessarily engage directly with the people that will be impacted by something until government has allowed you to do so. And so that kind of means that you're on the back foot, and that a lot of work has already been done prior to that. But there is a real shift at the moment towards trying to support a co-design process as much as possible. So it's less about sort of research to find out like what the causes of the issues are, but more sort of coming at the point of agreeing. So I think it's like after academia has done all of the hard work to really identify the core issues, we'll then come along and say, all right, let's take the journey together and try and resolve that. But the reality is as well that politics is pretty fickle, and you might have the interest of the minister one day, but that can just sort of go quite quickly. So we are often working to very short timeframes, limited budget, and so there is a real risk of consultation, stakeholder research fatigue. So yeah, I think that's the real challenge for us is how to make sure that you're actually speaking to the right people that you need to, because they are the ones that know the issues most and they know how to resolve it, without necessarily taking advantage of their goodwill and creating a lot of expectation for change, and then something is outside of your control and it gets stopped. And that is a real risk, and certainly something that I have seen.
Thanks, Caleb. Jennifer, any thoughts from you? No, okay, that's fine. We've got one more question in the chat page, and that's probably the last one we've got time for, which is quite handy. And it's linked to Sean's question. Ian's asking, in a current environment of toxic narratives, Ian's talking specifically about the UK/England and Wales cultural context being a key challenge. Can we learn from other models like the Scandinavian model focused around social pedagogies? If the current socio-political climate presents opportunities for change, and where do we start? I guess that's kind of a nice one to draw things together. From each of you, what ideally is the first thing we need to do to get these changes rolling and achieve meaningful change?
I think if we wanted to achieve a meaningful change and adopt more Scandinavian models, i.e. much more welfare-based, then it's not just a change within structures, but it's actually a whole cultural context of a nation. And how do we do that? How do we frame? What I'm trying to say is, within Scandinavian context, they're very much more compassionate, understanding of circumstances, understanding of the situations in which people may get themselves into, understanding that people make mistakes without doing a whole eye for eye type of agenda. So if we were to utilize that within the UK, it's great to have it in terms of small organizations or grassroots organizations that can do that quite effectively, but to broaden that out would mean to get the public politics to also be on board with that type of thinking, to try and emit any type of change. So I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible. I think it would just be a big hurdle to cross, because it's a very different way of approaching what is essentially a problematic situation, particularly if you're looking at aspects of crime. They treat it very differently. So yeah, I think it's a much broader discussion to have in terms of how do we as the UK understand or frame certain instances compared to that of Scandinavia. But we do have a lot to learn from each other. You know, I'm not saying we're all bad. I'm just saying we can be much harsher at times than we need to be.
Thanks, Shante. Thoughts from others?
I think it comes down to communities. I think communities can make a huge difference. Communities that are united around a particular issue, supported perhaps by sort of grassroots activists. And I think academia and academics have a role to play there, actually, around giving space and voice to organisations who represent, give voice to organised communities and activists that represent those communities. So I think rather than, I'm thinking more from the bottom up is what I'm thinking, and looking to the successes that such community organisations can achieve. And I think there's a lot to be said around empowering communities, galvanising communities, supporting them to make those changes. I think that's my sort of take on that question. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Jennifer or Caitlin, any thoughts from either of you?
I'm not, I think this might just be more of a reflection, but again, speaking as a public servant, not an academic, one of the issues that we have is the economies of scale. So the sort of the sheer volume of matters that the justice system is dealing with in Victoria at the moment really does limit the ability to kind of draw from some of the smaller jurisdictions. And I think we do apply a lot of principles of that, trying to kind of have the grassroots work and community place-basing activities and all of those sorts of things. But it's quite difficult to kind of have like a consistent approach or an ability to kind of ensure that the funding is appropriately dispersed across all the various areas. And so I know that that's a real challenge from our perspective. Something works really, really well in a small scale, but there's really a lot of questions about how to scale it up. And that's, yeah, I think probably an area where we still have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Caitlin. Any final thoughts from you there, Jennifer?
Well, when it comes to meaningful change, well, that will lead to obviously sustainability long-term of reform efforts. Once local ownership, which is what usually kicks in at the end of reforms. To achieve meaningful change long-term, I personally think that the one-size-fits-all approach to reform efforts from external actors should probably be reconsidered, because a lot of the time ideas are adopted from the West and they're basically adapted to suit different contexts in developing regions. And just like I said, with colonialism, it's difficult to obviously change the way the West pretty much works on when it comes to reforms with developing regions, partly because colonialism is when a lot of the structures that are in place at the moment were developed. So the organograms, just the way the police works in general. So during colonialism, the police were basically, it was a concept, or the police as a concept, I guess, was introduced to pretty much cater to the needs of the colonizers. And then once independence kicked in, those who became independent leaders then pretty much just used the institution the way that colonizers used it. And obviously things have changed as time has gone on, but in terms of the usage of the police, it's still quite an issue. It's still a huge issue. And because obviously the knowledge, when it comes to reforming or developing the concept of police and policing in developing regions, has not been an organic process like it's been in the UK, for example. It's quite difficult to respect that there are differences when it comes to societal needs, when it comes to security, because prior to those institutions being developed in the first place and external ideas being introduced, individuals already had their own way of ensuring their daily security, hence why till this day there's that divide of acceptance of state security and individuals providing their own daily security, because one, there's a lack of understanding of what some of these institutions really are. And so when it comes to meaningful change, there needs to be eradication of a one-size-fits-all approach, better understanding of the context in which they, better understanding as well as respect for the context in which reforms are being occurring. And there needs to be more political will, with obviously the citizens' needs at the heart of the whole process from all parties, both external and local governments as well. I don't want to eat into the time, but that's all I can think of for now.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks to all four of you, Chris, Jennifer, Caitlin, and Shante. For some reason, I've managed to read every name around the right order, and I got to Shantae's surname first, so apologies for that. That was really interesting, and lots of cross-cutting themes emerging there, even though on the face of things might feel reasonably disparate. As I said, this is the first of 3 webinars that we're going to be running. The next one is going to be focused around issues in post-colonial justice, and that's going to be at the beginning of May, whilst the 3rd session will be exploring issues in relation to climate justice and the climate crisis. So hopefully lots of food for thought for everyone there. Over and above thanking our 4 speakers for their excellent contributions, thank you to everybody else for turning up, and particularly for those of you, Sean, Ian and Geraldine, for your questions. It's been a really interesting time. I will be circulating, once I've got this downloaded and I've fixed my internet issues at home, I will get this uploaded to YouTube and circulate the link around to everybody who's been in attendance and wider networks. And I look forward to speaking to you all and working with you all in the near and distant future. And at some point I will get across to Australia. I have no idea when though, Caitlin, but at which point I will come say hi.
You're all very welcome.
Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon and a very happy Easter for those of you that are celebrating.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.